Alright, and let's... what the fuck is this? See, once again, here we have a boss, and he just comes out of nowhere. I don't know who the fuck he is. The game is not trying to make me care about who he is. It's just another fucking generic enemy that I don't give a fuck about with a long ass health bar. And this is how most of the bosses in this game are. They just pop out of nowhere and you just don't give a fuck because the game doesn't give a fuck about you giving a fuck.
These passages seem too small for giants. Why do you laugh?
Oh, you're serious.
I am always serious.
Yeah, and that's probably why I cannot take you seriously as a character, because you're always oh so serious. This part of the game right here, this particular combat encounter, captures exactly what's wrong with the combat system. Because this is how most of the combat encounters in this game are set up. You are placed in a very tight space to where if you run into a wall, if you back into a wall, on either side of you or behind you, you're pretty much screwed. Especially if you're playing on a higher difficulty like I was. And then on top of that, there's so many distractions in the environment that can trip you up. And it's not like the game has a good camera to where, you know, it captures everything that's happening on screen. No, the camera is very tight and close up on your ass, so you can't really see what's going on to the left of you or to the right of you, or even behind you. Because they want everything to be so cinematic and epic. When the older God of War games didn't have this issue at all.
I mean, I get angry at you sometimes, but...
Do you?
I mean, sometimes, yeah. A little. But I'd never stab you in the back.
Perhaps if you did, then this game's story would be halfway interesting. Which it's not. Here's another problem with this game, with the lack of originality, where it's copying a boss fight from another video game. Which is the fucking Orstein and Smaug boss fight from Dark Souls. This is pretty much a clone of that boss fight. And all the dumb fanboys were saying, oh, the game developers were being original. They were innovating. They didn't innovate, they just stole several elements from other games and just randomly inserted them in this.
Middle bar.
Gotta get them in order. Left, sunrise.
Middle, quickly.
So this was the fucking game that got nominated for Game of the Year and won at the Game Awards. This stupid shit right here. This is the game that all these fucking dumbass gaming journalists, all these fucking fanboys were praising, giving 10 out of 10s across the fucking board. This is the game right here. This was the best video game of 2018. A game that fucking butchers the God of War franchise. This fucking shit right here. This garbage right here. This is the best game that came out this year. Give me a fucking break. God of War was developed by Sony Santa Monica and published by Sony Computer Entertainment. This is a PlayStation exclusive that came out earlier this year in April. It was announced a few years ago at E3, and I remember the night that they showed off gameplay footage for the first time for this game. I remember being at work. I was about to go on my lunch break, and one of my good friends texted me, and he was like, I'm so disappointed in the reveal for God of War. And I'm like, well, you know, what's the problem? And so I went on my break and I took a look at what Sony Santa Monica revealed And what they showed was a game that didn't resemble God of War. It's a game that closely resembled The Last of Us, which I'll get to later. And so I had already decided that I wasn't going to get this game because I already knew I wasn't going to like it. Because it's not a God of War game. There's nothing about it that even closely resembles God of War. Like if you took Kratos out of this game and you took the Blades of Athena out of this game, you wouldn't even be able to identify it as a God of War game. Not in its gameplay, not in its story, not in its presentation, nothing. The only reason I bought this game, because I originally skipped this game when it came out earlier this year. The only reason why I went ahead and I bought this is because the game won at the Game Awards for Best Video Game of 2018. It won Game of the Year. As I stated in another video that I made recently on my channel, the one regarding that the Game of the Year award is garbage and they usually give it to a mediocre game every single year, which is fact. I went ahead and I bought this game used for $26 on GameFly, and I spent about 6 days playing it. 6 days it took me to get through the game, in my free time. And everything that I stated before in the video I made a month before this game's release months ago is accurate. Everything I stated in that video and more, and then some, is what's wrong with God of War 2018. So, what is this game exactly? God of War 2018 is a soft reboot of the God of War franchise. It's a soft reboot because it's a continuation of the God of War series narratively. But gameplay-wise, it's a complete reboot. It has virtually nothing in common with the older God of War games. So let me start off with the story and why this game sucks. So the story revolves around Kratos, an older Kratos, an aged Kratos, who now has a son named Atreus. At the beginning of the game, Kratos and Atreus burn the corpse of Kratos' wife, whom you never get to see. You don't even get to see what she looks like, at least at the beginning. And throughout pretty much the entire game's story, you never get to see her. And I only played through the story. I haven't really dived into the side quests, all the different side quests that you can do, aside from some of the missions with the dwarves and the spirits. The entire game is about Kratos and Atreus going up to a summit. This old grumpy man and his annoying son going up to this summit so they can spread the ashes of this dead woman whom you never get to know or meet in the game's story. That's the entire game. That's the journey that these two go on. To go up to some peak somewhere in the middle of nowhere, essentially, just so they can spread a dead woman's ashes in the distance somewhere, just out in the open. And that captures a lot of what's wrong with this game's story. As I already stated, you don't give a fuck about the wife in this game, because you never get to meet her. You never get to see her. You never get to see how Kratos met her or the relationship he had with her. You only hear about her as a background character during the exploration of the game, where Kratos or Atreus will bring up the mother, and Atreus will mention the kind of person that his mother was, and then Kratos will comment on that. And it's like, that's nice and all, but I don't give a fuck because I don't know the wife. I don't know that character. And so the entire story is just dumb. It feels like a waste of time. And that's just the story. I'm going to talk about what's wrong with the combat system. So when it comes to the combat system, first of all, anything I've ever said that's bad about the combat system of the Souls games or Souls-like games, I take it all back now. Because at least they had a good camera in those games. The biggest issue with God of War's combat system, this new entry in the series, is the camera. It's way too close up on your ass. And the game developers knew this was going to be an issue. That's why they put the little markers on screen, so whenever something's about to attack you from behind, the game will highlight on the side of the screen and show you, when you're about to get attacked. And then they also put in Atreus and the talking head on Kratos' butt later in the game to give out warnings in combat. And first of all, that's very annoying to have an NPC in the video game tell you, oh, look out, oh, look, do this, do that, watch out, something is about to come from behind and attack you. You know, it's like that's bullshit. Let me play the fucking game myself. I don't need your help. I don't want your help. Let me play the fucking game on my own. Let me make my own mistakes. I don't need your assistance. And that's just one major issue with the combat system. Another issue is the fact that you only have 2 weapons the entire fucking game. 2. The first is the Leviathan Axe, which the attack animations for that is very slow and unintuitive. And then you have the Blades of Chaos from the original God of War games. And the Blades of Chaos are good, or they're okay, but because the combat system's completely changed, they're not the same. You don't get the same feeling that you got in the older God of War games, because they took out the aerial-based combat. You can't jump in this game. They took out the aerial-based combat, so there's no aerial-based combat in this game. And a lot of the enemies that they put on screen, either they're too easy or they're too difficult in terms of Kratos' reaction time to them. Where, you know, you'll press a button and, you know, sometimes you'll want to evade, sometimes you want to attack, sometimes you want to do a mixture of both and mix things up. And the game just will not allow you to attack or to evade because the combat system isn't as fluid and responsive as it should be. And that's an issue. That's another big issue. The combat is really shit in this game. Most of it boils down to you spamming the attack button, which they stole the controls mechanism for the combat system from the Dark Souls games, because the game developers were quote-unquote innovating, which they really weren't. Yeah, most of the game's combat system boils down to you spamming the R1 button or the R2 button, and then spamming the square button, which will command Atreus to fire his arrows. And as soon as you get the lightning-based arrows, the electric-based arrows in this game, the game just becomes a cakewalk. There is really zero challenge after that. And the only way you'll end up dying is, once again, the game being unresponsive. So, the combat is dog shit in this fucking game, especially in comparison to the older God of War games, which had a zoomed out camera because they were action-based video games, and the game developers didn't have their head in their ass. And also because the older God of War games gave you a plethora of different weapons to use, such as the spear you got in God of War 3 after you defeated Hades, or the head of Urael from God of War 2, or the gauntlets that you got from killing Hercules in God of War 3. So all the weapon variety in this game is just gone. And you can unequip your weapons and then just use Kratos' shield and his fist. But doing that doesn't really play out well in your favor because the damage output for that is extremely low. And so it just becomes useless. So that's the combat system, which is dog shit yet again. Another big issue with this God of War is the fact that they tried to make it an open world game, but it's not a true open world game. It's a semi-open world game, which means there's one large essential hub in the game, and then you have these smaller locations that are still big. They're just not as big as the main hub. And in this main hub, which is called the Lake of Nine, it's empty. It's empty as shit. It's beautiful. It's great with the graphics and the presentation, but the world itself is not populated. This is another fucking overrated open world game where the game developers made this big ass world and didn't fill it with shit. Nier Automata had this issue, Metal Gear Solid 5 had this issue, Batman Arkham Knight had this issue. It's like, put some fucking NPCs in your goddamn game, dude. It's like, I play a game like Final Fantasy 15 or Horizon Zero Dawn, you know, something like that, where it's an open world game, and if I go to a settlement or a town, there's NPCs, there's people walking around, there's people I can interact with, you know, there's people I can take quests from. But no, not in God of War, because in God of War, what do you do in God of War's quote-unquote open world? Oh, you ride in a fucking rowboat with Kratos and his son, and they're telling jokes and stories to each other, and I'm supposed to give a fuck, because this is quote-unquote character development, which again, apparently that's innovation. And that's not innovation. That's boring. In one word, that's exactly what that is. That's just boring ass shit gameplay. Because you're not engaged in anything. You're not engaged in combat. You're not engaged in any particular storytelling in this game because there's hardly any story at all. The character development in this is weak. And because this game borrows a lot from The Last of Us, now I have to fucking compare it to that as well. Because this game pretty much stole its concept, its base concept, from that game. So if I compare Kratos and his relationship with Atreus with Joel and his relationship with Ellie from The Last of Us, Joel and Ellie from The Last of Us are actually interesting for one major reason. And that's the fact that Joel and Ellie aren't an actual father and daughter. They're a surrogate father and daughter. They have a surrogate parent-child relationship. At the beginning of The Last of Us, we see Joel lose his daughter, his real daughter, his biological daughter, in that game's prologue. When Joel meets Ellie, he doesn't like her. She doesn't like him. He just takes up the job of escorting her, finding the Fireflies and escorting her to the Fireflies to fulfill Tess's duty in that game. In this game, Kratos and Atreus are related. They're actual biological father and son. So there's not much character development to be had right there. At least in the way that this game is presenting. And Atreus himself comes off as just very annoying and generic. Personality-wise, he's completely the opposite of Kratos. He's optimistic, he's playful, he's very curious about the world that's around him. And Ellie was kind of the same way in The Last of Us, but she had a more down-to-earth personality, and her dialogue didn't seem like it was just forced. Everything felt natural in that game compared to this. And then the whole point of The Last of Us had a stronger story than this game does. And the story was present throughout the entire thing. There's hardly any story in God of War. Like I said earlier in this video, the entire game is about Kratos and Atreus going up to a mountain peak to spread some dead woman's ashes. That's the entire game. That's stupid and it's boring as shit. In The Last of Us, there was a point as to why Joel was escorting Ellie to the Fireflies. It's because Ellie was immune to the spores and she couldn't turn into one of the clickers. She couldn't turn into one of the zombies from that game, which means potentially her blood had the essentials to make a cure, a possible cure in that game, which could save humanity. So the game pretty much had a save the girl, save the world type of vibe in that game. And that made everything that Joel and Ellie did in that game feel meaningful. Nothing in this game feels meaningful because the story is stupid. And then there's the side quests in the game that don't make any sense. Kratos and Atreus go around and they help out these random NPCs. And NPCs aren't interesting, of course, because the world is empty as fuck. And so they're helping out dead spirits who haven't moved on. And it's like one of the side quests, the dead spirit asked me to go and collect these bones. And I'm like, I'm collecting bones? Why am I collecting bones in this game? In that particular side quest, he promised Atreus and Kratos that they could potentially speak to the mother, the dead mother that's in the game. And I was like, okay, this doesn't really make any sense. And even Kratos himself was telling Atreus, don't get your hopes up. You know, the spirit is lying. And of course, when you deliver the bones to the spirit, one of the game's witches, a more powerful version of the witch, which is one of the enemy variants in this game, one of the few enemy variants, attacks you and you have to kill it. And that's the side mission. That's not interesting. And then you have these dwarf characters that are in the game. They're really the only other NPCs that are in the game. And the dwarves really act as merchants, where you go to them and you can upgrade your armor and you can craft, you know, armor, weapons, whatever, and get stronger. And the problem with the dwarf characters is that they're blacksmiths, and the only people that are buying from them are Kratos and Atreus. And it's like the game developers put in blacksmiths in the game, and the only people that are buying from them are the characters that the player is playing as. How does that make any sense? That makes no sense at all. And it's not like you're giving them some kind of false currency. Like in the Fallout games, you have the bottle caps. No, in this game, you're giving them legitimate money. And it's like, I compare that to Dark Souls, and in the Dark Souls games, there's also only like one single merchant. But you're giving the merchant the souls of the enemies that you kill in that game. So it has a fantasy vibe to it. But in God of War, that's not what's going on. You're giving them physical, monetary-based money in the game. And that doesn't make any sense. It's stupid. Because there are no other NPCs in the game. What are they going to use the money for? And then, whenever you go from one place to another, they randomly pop up in another location. It's like, how the hell did you get here? Did you take the fucking bus? They're conveniently, like, in the same place every single time you go to a new location in this game. And it's so fucking stupid, it's a joke. Then you have the skill set that's in this game, the different skill trees, and all it is like 3 or 4 unique abilities that upgrade over time throughout the game. And if you do a few side missions, you'll be able to unlock pretty much all of the skills pretty quickly. And the skills aren't interesting. They're just variants of one small move that you can do in the game, and not all of them are useful. So the game doesn't have a good skill tree. Another big issue with this God of War that I knew was going to be a problem long before I played this game is the fact that Sony Santa Monica turned this God of War into an RPG. And that just creates a whole nother level of issues. Because success in combat really doesn't boil down to skill anymore like it did in the older God of War games. Now it's all about stats. As long as you have a strong enough weapon, a strong enough set of armor, you could be dog shit at the game and still win. Especially if you're playing on a lower difficulty level. Or even if you're playing on one of the higher difficulty levels, with the exception of the last one, which just turns the enemies into damage sponges. The God of War difficulty level, I believe it's called. And so this game has a collectathon mentality because they turned it into an RPG. Because they turned this game into a semi-open world game. And when you design an open world game, you have to get the player to feel like they're actually progressing because they're in one base location throughout the entire game. And the easiest way to do that is to turn the game into an RPG. And so that's what they did here. And it's boring. You can tell this game was conceived in a generic RPG factory where you go to a merchant, you have enough components, and you have enough money to buy new weapons, new armor, or upgrade the weapons and armor that you already have. And then you can add components on top of that. You can add rooms to your different weapons. You can add different perks, different abilities to the weapons that you have in the game. And that's it. There's really no depth in the game, because it's just generic. Once again, these are things that are done much better in other video game franchises. And God of War was never an RPG. So why they turned it into one is beyond me. God of War was also never an open world game. God of War was a very linear experience that lasted 8 to 12 hours depending on the difficulty level that you were playing on and your personal skill level. And by the end of the game, you got your money's worth. In this game, you have to spend 20 hours or more playing the entire thing. And most of what you're doing is just going from location to location, fighting enemies, picking up everything that they drop. It's one of those looting games that has that OCD mentality, where you have to pick up every single thing that's dropped so you can use it later on. Or so even like basic items, like if you want to replenish your health, you got to pick up these little healing items that the enemies drop. And it wasn't like that in the older God of War games. In the older God of War games, you just simply found a chest that gave you health, and you open the chest and it would give you health. You didn't have to constantly pick shit up every time you killed an enemy in one of those games. And so basically, from the gameplay to the story to the exploration, it's just dog shit. It's all dog shit because it's so generic and boring and predictable. And I kept reading throughout the entire year how great this game was, and it's not. Cory Barlog, the creator of God of War, he didn't innovate. This is not innovation. He simply took a look at the market, observed what was popular. So you have The Last of Us, which won over 200 Game of the Year awards. So he decided to use that game's formula, or a part of that game's formula, by having a child NPC follow you around the entire fucking game, which worked for The Last of Us, but it doesn't really work in God of War, for reasons that I mentioned earlier in the video. And then he also took a look at what the hardcore audience was playing. And that audience loves Dark Souls. They love the Souls games. So From Software and their bullshit. So he decided to take elements from those games. And then he decided to take elements from The Last of Us. And then he decided to take elements from the older God of War games. And he put them all into a blender. And what you get is an overrated ass piece of shit game that destroys the God of War franchise. And it's ironic because clearly they didn't make this game for older God of War fans. They made this game for people who weren't fans of God of War to begin with. People who never gave a shit about God of War and never appreciated the series for what it was. And what God of War was one of the best video game franchises in the industry. Period. Those games had a great presentation, a great combat system, a great story, and a great main character. Kratos was a no-nonsense character who was tortured about a deal that he made with the gods, and he wanted revenge. And if you got in his way, you were going to die. He had a very simple goal, and that goal was vengeance. And in his quest to get vengeance against the gods, he hoped that was going to lead him to peace, and it didn't. In this game, Kratos is a bitch. His son isn't interesting as a character, and you just don't give a shit. Especially if you've played the older God of War games and you compare it to this new one. None of it makes any sense. And then you have the fucking boss fights in this game. And none of the boss fights are interesting with the exception of the Baldur character. And you don't even know who that character is until the very end of the game. The bosses just come out of nowhere, they just pop up on screen, a long ass health bar goes across the bottom of the screen, and you just don't give a fuck. The game doesn't try and explain who the bosses are or why you're fighting them, and the bosses are too easy too, especially in comparison to the older God of War games. I was playing on the second hardest difficulty, and I didn't really have trouble with any of them, aside from the flying winged creature. There's hardly any fucking challenge to be had with any of the boss fights. And the only truly good boss fight is the Baldur boss fight at the end of the game. That's it. Everything else is shit. It's garbage. They didn't even try and make the bosses interesting. So as I stated earlier in this video, this game was overpraised before it came out. It's a game that was overpraised after its release. It got 10 out of 10s across the board. It sold millions upon millions of copies. It was nominated for Game of the Year at the Game Awards, and it won because it was voted on by a bunch of dumbass gaming journalists who, once again, have their head up their ass. And dumbass gaming journalists, of course, don't know shit about gaming. Of course, they choose the most generic, half-ass, lazy-ass game to win Game of the Year. And fanboys eat it up because the fanboys are stupid too. And it's funny because this game didn't win Best Narrative at the Game Awards. Red Dead Redemption 2 won that award. And they couldn't give that award to God of War because, once again, there's hardly any fucking story in this game. What little story is there is stupid and doesn't make any sense. And then, at the end of this game, after you beat it, they just throw in something random that doesn't add anything to Atreus' character. Apparently, Atreus is Loki. That was the name that the mother wanted to give him. But Kratos decided to name him Atreus, which is the name of a Spartan warrior. And the thing is, this kid looks like he's about 10 or 11 years old. So he's no fucking warrior. No, he's just a little kid. But apparently, Atreus is Loki, the god of mischief. In, what is it, Norse mythology? It's like, is that supposed to add anything to his character, or am I supposed to give a fuck? They just throw in so many random elements in this game that just don't make any sense. And even the fucking premise of the game doesn't even make any sense. This God of War takes place in the Norse mythology universe, when all of the previous God of War games take place in a Greek mythology universe. How did Kratos end up in the Norse mythology world when he destroyed the world at the end of God of War 3? The game doesn't even try and bridge the gap between God of War 3 and this game. And in the beginning of this game, where do we first meet Kratos? Oh, he's in his backyard cutting down a fucking tree. In the older God of War games, Kratos was in a fucking fight. These huge epic battles at the beginning of God of War 1, 2, and 3 in those games' prologue. And by comparison, it's just not interesting. I could go on and on and on about how much this game fucking sucks, but the bottom line is this. God of War is dead. It's gone. It's been replaced by a generic, open world, RPG, just like just about every other game on the single player market for the modern video game industry. And the spirit of what God of War was is dead. It's gone, and it's not coming back. God of War really, truly ended at the end of God of War 3. When Kratos disappeared at the end of that game, that was it. That was the end of God of War right there. This new game is a complete slap in the face to the OG fans of the series, and it's an insult to anyone who appreciated the older God of War games for what they were. So this is another franchise that has been ruined in the 8th console generation. And it's just sad and unfortunate because God of War was my second favorite video game franchise behind Ratchet and Clank. And I really held the series in high regard. I still hold the older games in high regard. You know, those are some of the best video games ever made. But this shit, this isn't God of War. And this game isn't nowhere close to being on the same level of quality as the older games. It may have a great presentation, it may have great graphics, it may have a great art style to the game, but the older God of War games had all that and then some. So, yeah, fuck this game, fuck Cory Barlog, fuck Sony Santa Monica Studios, fuck the fanboys who bought into this shit. You know, the whole point of these retrospectives isn't to review the game. The whole point of these retrospectives is to objectively look at each game and answer the question whether the game was a success or a failure. And I'm basing that question on whether or not the game is a good game or a bad game. I don't care how many copies a game has sold. I don't care how popular a game is. I don't care how big of a fan base the game has. I don't care what the stupid ass gaming journalist gave the game. I don't care if the game has great graphics, a great presentation, a good soundtrack. Because at the end of the day, it's all about the gameplay and the story and the characters and all that. Just because a game sold millions of copies, or just because a game has great graphics and a great presentation and a good soundtrack, or just because dumbass gaming journalists and fanboys online have overpraised the fuck out of a particular title, doesn't make that game good. If anything, the music industry has proven that the masses typically generally have a high level of tolerance for garbage. And the video game industry is no different. And so when it comes to this game, this is not a good game. It's not a good open world game. It's not a good RPG. It's not a good narrative based game. It's not a good God of War game for goddamn sure. None of the characters are interesting. The fucking world serpent or whatever they put in the fucking game, that big ass snake thing that they teased at E3 that you can't fight, which turned out to be fucking disappointing as fuck. Like I said, man, this game sucks. Fuck this game. God of War is done. It's over. You want to play fucking God of War, go play the older fucking games. The actual good fucking games. Because this new shit, it's a joke. It's a complete fucking joke. That's my retrospective for God of War. Now, I just ordered Red Dead Redemption 2 as of me recording this video. So when that arrives in a few days, I'm going to play that. And I'm going to make a retrospective on that. And I'm really looking forward to playing that game. And there's quite a few games that I'm looking forward to that are coming in 2019. And eventually what I want to do is make a top 10 list, a real top 10 list, not the garbage top 10 list that you find on IGN and GameSpot, for, you know, the top 10 best video games that have come out since the PS4 and the Xbox One launch, which was 5 years ago. So I plan on making that video at some point. But for now, those things are on standby until further notice.